Welcome to Secrets of the Invisible. Before Christopher Columbus set foot in the Caribbean in 1492, the Americas were not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were home to somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people, living in sophisticated civilizations with urban planning that rivaled anything in Europe, medical knowledge that included successful brain surgery, and legal systems that would later influence the United States Constitution. The myth of the Virgin Land was not a mistake of history. It was a deliberate lie, constructed to justify the largest act of dispossession in human history. Let's begin. By 1600, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was dead, and most of them never saw a European face. The Cahokia settlement near modern-day St. Louis, Illinois, had a population larger than London in the year 1100. The city featured planned neighborhoods, a sophisticated understanding of astronomy reflected in massive earthwork mounds, and a trade network that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. When French explorers finally reached the Mississippi River Valley in the 1600s, they found the mounds but couldn't believe indigenous people had built them. They attributed the structures to a lost race of mound builders, a myth that persisted in American textbooks until the 1960s. The evidence of advanced civilization was too threatening to the narrative of primitive peoples in need of European guidance. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to the English as the Iroquois, had developed a democratic system of government by the 15th century that featured checks and balances, the ability to impeach leaders, and guaranteed participation of women in selecting chiefs. Benjamin Franklin explicitly referenced the Iroquois system when arguing for colonial unity at the Albany Congress of 1754. Historian Bruce Johansen documented how at least 28 specific features of the United States Constitution showed direct influence from Haudenosaunee governance, including the federal structure itself. The Founding Fathers borrowed from the people they were systematically destroying. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and found a city of over 200,000 people built on an island in Lake Texcoco. The Spanish conquistadors wrote descriptions of broad causeways, aqueducts bringing fresh water from miles away, botanical gardens, and a marketplace that served 60,000 people daily. The city was larger and cleaner than any European capital of the era. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's army, wrote that when they first saw the city from the mountains, some of the men questioned whether they were dreaming, so magnificent was the sight. Within 2 years, Spanish diseases and warfare had reduced the population by half. Within a century, the lake was drained, the city was rubble, and the engineering knowledge that built it was lost. The population collapse of the Americas was the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. Estimates vary, but scholarly consensus places the pre-contact population between 50 million and 100 million. By 1650, the indigenous population had fallen to approximately 5 to 6 million. That represents a death rate of 90 to 95% over 150 years. To put that in perspective, the Black Death killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population over 4 years and fundamentally reshaped European society, economy, and culture for centuries. The American apocalypse was 3 times as deadly and lasted 30 times as long. The primary killer was not warfare, it was disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, cholera, malaria, and yellow fever swept through populations that had no immunity to old-world pathogens. The Columbian Exchange worked both ways, bringing syphilis to Europe, but the biological weapons flowing from east to west were incomparably more devastating. A single infected European could walk into a village and trigger an epidemic that would kill 90% of the population within weeks. The diseases often moved faster than European explorers themselves, spreading through trade routes and depopulating entire regions before colonists arrived to find empty land they could claim as their own. The first smallpox epidemic in Hispaniola began in 1518. Within 3 years, the indigenous population of the island had fallen from an estimated 1 million to fewer than 30,000. The disease reached Mexico in 1520 and killed between 5 million and 8 million Aztecs within 2 years. It spread to Peru by 1525, arriving before Francisco Pizarro's conquistadors and killing the Incan emperor Huayna Capac, along with his designated heir, triggering a civil war that left the empire vulnerable to Spanish conquest. When Pizarro arrived in 1532, he found an empire already shattered by disease and internal conflict. The Great Dying, as some historians call it, transformed the landscape itself. Millions of acres of cultivated land returned to wilderness within decades. The forests that European colonists found in North America and described as pristine wilderness were actually young secondary growth reclaiming abandoned agricultural land. Pollen core samples from lake beds show a dramatic decline in maize pollen and a corresponding increase in tree pollen beginning in the early 1500s. The quote one was a mass grave. Some colonial authorities recognized that disease was doing their work for them and actively sought to weaponize it. The most documented case occurred during Pontiac's War in 1763. British forces were besieged at Fort Pitt in western Pennsylvania by a coalition of indigenous nations. Captain Simeon Equier, the fort's commander, recorded in his journal giving 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the fort's smallpox hospital to Delaware negotiators. He wrote that he hoped it will have the desired effect. His superior officer, Colonel Henry Bouquet, wrote to General Jeffrey Amherst suggesting they try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets. Amherst replied, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." The language was explicit. The intent was genocide. Whether the blankets successfully transmitted smallpox is debated, but the fact that British military officers discussed biological warfare against indigenous populations as a legitimate tactic is not. The correspondence exists in the British Museum. The moral calculation was clear. Indigenous people were obstacles to be removed by any means necessary, and disease was simply another tool in the arsenal of conquest. The demographic collapse destabilized every aspect of indigenous society. Complex civilizations require population density to maintain specialization of labor, to defend territory, to preserve knowledge across generations. When 90% of the population dies within a few generations, the survivors cannot maintain urban centers, cannot staff armies, cannot preserve oral traditions or specialized crafts. The Mississippian culture that built Cahokia collapsed completely. The trade networks that connected the Americas from the Arctic to Patagonia fractured. Entire languages disappeared, taking with them irreplaceable knowledge of agriculture, medicine, astronomy, and governance. If you're finding this information valuable, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts. It helps us reach more people who want to understand the full story. The legal and religious framework for European claims to indigenous land was established before Columbus ever sailed. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Romanus Pontifex, granting Portugal the right to claim lands inhabited by quote, _5 and to reduce their inhabitants to perpetual slavery. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued Inter Caetera, dividing the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal and authorizing them to, quote, 6 and, quote, 7 indigenous populations. These documents established the doctrine of discovery, the principle that Christian European nations had the legal right to claim sovereignty over non-Christian lands regardless of who was already living there. The doctrine of discovery was not an obscure medieval relic. It became the foundation of property law in European colonies and later in the United States. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh explicitly cited the doctrine of discovery in ruling that Native Americans had rights of occupancy but not rights of ownership to their ancestral lands. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that, quote, the logic was circular and brutal. Europeans discovered the land, therefore Europeans owned it, and indigenous people were reduced to tenants on their own territory. The practical application of this legal fiction was systematic dispossession. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized President Andrew Jackson to negotiate treaties exchanging indigenous lands east of the Mississippi River for territory in the West. The law required that removal be voluntary and negotiated through treaties. In practice, it was neither. The Cherokee Nation had done everything the United States government demanded. They had established a written constitution modeled on the United States Constitution, built schools and churches, published a newspaper in their own alphabet, and won recognition of their sovereignty from the United States Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. Chief Justice Marshall ruled that Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on Cherokee territory. Andrew Jackson reportedly responded, Quote 9. The quote may be apocryphal, but the actions that followed were not. Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court ruling. In 1838, federal troops and Georgia militia rounded up approximately 15,000 Cherokee people at gunpoint, confiscated their property, and forced them to march over 1,000 miles to designated territory in what would become Oklahoma. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died of exposure, disease, and starvation during the march and in the concentration camps where they were held before departure. The Cherokee were not the only nation subjected to forced removal. The Choctaw were removed in 1831 through 1833. Witnesses described seeing people marching through snow without shoes, children dying of pneumonia, elderly people abandoned by the roadside when they could not keep pace. The Creek removal in 1836 involved the Army forcibly marching people in chains after a failed resistance. The Chickasaw negotiated slightly better terms but still lost their ancestral lands. The Seminole fought 3 wars of resistance, with some fleeing to the Everglades rather than submit to removal. By 1850, approximately 100,000 indigenous people had been forcibly relocated west of the Mississippi River, and tens of thousands had died in the process. The United States government signed over 500 treaties with indigenous nations between 1778 and 1871. According to a 2012 study by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, the United States violated provisions of every single one. The pattern was consistent: negotiate a treaty guaranteeing indigenous land rights, wait for settlers to illegally move into the guaranteed territory, use the presence of settlers as justification for renegotiating a new treaty with less land, repeat. Each treaty was described as final and permanent. None were honored. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 guaranteed the Sioux Nation ownership of the Black Hills in perpetuity. The treaty stated that no further land cessions would be valid unless approved by 3/4 of adult Sioux men. In 1874, George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the Black Hills in violation of the treaty and announced the discovery of gold. Prospectors flooded the region. The United States government demanded the Sioux sell the Black Hills. When they refused, the government declared all Sioux not living on designated reservations to be hostile and subject to military attack. The resulting Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877 included the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer was killed, but ended with Sioux defeat and forced cession of the Black Hills. The required 3/4 approval was never obtained. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation that the seizure of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded the Sioux $106 million in compensation. The Sioux refused the money, which has grown with interest to over $1 billion because accepting it would legitimize the theft. They still demand the return of the land. The underlying ideology driving removal and treaty violation was the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent was not only justified but divinely ordained. The phrase was coined by journalist John O'Sullivan in 1845 in an essay advocating for the annexation of Texas. He wrote that it was America's, quote, "and the language transformed conquest into a moral imperative." Indigenous people were not being dispossessed, they were simply in the way of historical inevitability. Manifest destiny provided rhetorical cover for policies designed to eliminate Indigenous people as distinct political and cultural entities. If Indigenous nations could not be removed entirely, they could be destroyed as nations through the destruction of their culture, language, and social structures. This was not an accident or an unfortunate side effect of settlement. It was official United States policy articulated by the highest levels of government. In 1867, a congressional committee report on Indian affairs stated, quote, "The blueprint for cultural destruction was laid out explicitly. Separate children from their families, forbid them from speaking their languages or practicing their religions, and indoctrinate them with the values of the dominant culture." The boarding school system that emerged from this policy became one of the most devastating instruments of cultural genocide in American history. The first federally funded off-reservation boarding school was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt, a former military officer who had overseen Indigenous prisoners of war. Pratt's philosophy was summarized in a speech he gave in 1892. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," became the unofficial motto of the boarding school system. Children as young as 4 years old were forcibly taken from their families, often by armed agents or local police. Parents who resisted could have their food rations cut off or be arrested. The schools were often located hundreds or thousands of miles from the children's homes to prevent families from maintaining contact. Upon arrival, children had their hair cut, their traditional clothing confiscated, and their names replaced with English names. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages under threat of physical punishment. Former students testified to being beaten with leather straps, locked in basements, or having their mouths washed with lye soap for speaking their own language. The curriculum emphasized manual labor and domestic service. Boys were taught farming, carpentry, and blacksmithing. Girls were taught cooking, sewing, and housekeeping. Academic education was minimal. The goal was not to prepare Indigenous children for professional careers, but to train them as laborers and servants in white society. Students were often hired out to local white families or businesses, with the school keeping most or all of their wages. Death rates at boarding schools were staggering. A 2021 report by the United States Department of the Interior identified over 400 boarding schools that operated between 1819 and 1969 and documented at least 500 deaths of children in these institutions. Investigators believe the actual number is significantly higher because many schools did not keep proper records or actively concealed deaths. Children died of tuberculosis, influenza, and other infectious diseases that spread rapidly in overcrowded, poorly ventilated dormitories. They died of malnutrition because schools were chronically underfunded and food was inadequate. They died of physical abuse. They died attempting to run away in harsh weather. Many were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. The trauma of the boarding school system cascaded across generations. Children who grew up in institutions where affection was forbidden and physical punishment was routine did not learn how to be parents. They returned to their communities unable to speak their own language, disconnected from cultural practices, and often suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The last federally operated boarding school did not close until 1973. Thousands of survivors are still alive, and the intergenerational effects continue to shape Indigenous communities today. While the boarding schools targeted Indigenous culture through education, the United States government simultaneously attacked the economic foundation of Plains Indigenous nations through the systematic extermination of the American bison. In 1800, an estimated 30 million to 60 million bison roamed the Great Plains. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. The destruction was deliberate. The bison was the material and spiritual center of Plains Indigenous life. The animal provided food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods. Bison hunting shaped seasonal migration patterns, social organization, and religious practices. The herds were so vast that early travelers described taking hours to ride through a single herd. Artist George Catlin, traveling through the plains in the 1830s, wrote that the prairies were, quote, 14 within 50 years, that world was gone. The destruction began with commercial hide hunting in the 1860s. Railroads made it economically viable to ship bison hides to eastern markets for leather goods. Professional hunters, armed with high-powered rifles, could kill dozens of animals per day. The meat was often left to rot. Only the hides had commercial value. In 1872 alone, commercial hunters shipped 1,200,000 hides east. The slaughter accelerated until the southern herd was effectively extinct by 1878 and the northern herd by 1883. United States military and political leaders openly acknowledged that destroying the bison was a strategy to force Indigenous people onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, commanding general of the Military Division of the Missouri, told the Texas legislature in 1875 that hide hunters were doing more to settle the, quote, 15 than the entire United States Army. He advocated for hunters to be armed and encouraged, stating that destroying the bison would destroy the economic base of Plains Indigenous resistance. Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delano wrote in 1872 that, quote, 16, the policy worked exactly as intended. As the bison disappeared, Plains nations faced starvation. The choice became submission to reservation life and dependency on government rations, or death. When the herds were gone, resistance became impossible. The last free-roaming bands surrendered, not because they were militarily defeated, but because they had nothing left to eat. The destruction of indigenous religions was carried out with equal deliberateness. In 1883, the United States government established the Courts of Indian Offenses, tribunal systems on reservations with the authority to punish indigenous people for practicing traditional religions. The list of prohibited practices included sun dances, healing ceremonies, giveaway ceremonies, and any gathering that involved traditional drumming or dancing. Violation could result in imprisonment, withholding of rations, or forced labor. The ghost dance movement that emerged in 1889 became a particular target of suppression. The ghost dance was a religious movement that promised the return of deceased ancestors, the restoration of traditional ways of life, and the disappearance of white settlers through divine intervention. It was explicitly non-violent. Dancers wore special shirts they believed would protect them, and the central ritual involved days of continuous circular dancing accompanied by prayers and songs. The movement spread rapidly among reservations in the West as a form of spiritual resistance and hope in the face of cultural destruction. The United States government viewed the ghost dance as a threat to order on the reservations. Indian agents banned the practice and called in military forces to suppress it. On December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry surrounded a band of Lakota ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota. A shot was fired, though witnesses disagree on whether it came from a soldier or from a Lakota man. The soldiers opened fire with rifles and 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire artillery pieces capable of firing 50 shells per minute. The Lakota, most of whom were unarmed, were slaughtered. The official army count listed 150 Lakota dead, including 62 women and children. Other estimates place the number closer to 300. 25 soldiers died. Many from friendly fire. The Army awarded 20 medals of honor to soldiers who participated in the massacre. Wounded Knee was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of policies designed to destroy indigenous people as distinct cultural and political entities. By the end of the 19th century, the indigenous population of the United States had reached its lowest point, approximately 250,000 people, down from an estimated 5 million to 15 million within the current United States borders in 1492. Indigenous people controlled less than 2% of the land they had occupied 400 years earlier. Most of that land was on reservations, tracts of territory the United States government had deemed worthless for white settlement. The reservation system created what were effectively internal colonies, where indigenous people lived under direct federal control, with limited legal rights and no political autonomy. The Major Crimes Act of 1885 extended federal jurisdiction over serious crimes committed on reservations, stripping tribal courts of authority over their own citizens. The General Allotment Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Act, broke up communal reservation land into individual allotments that could be sold to white settlers. Reservation land holdings fell from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres by 1934. The stated goal of the Dawes Act was to encourage individual land ownership and farming, but the practical effect was to transfer indigenous land to white ownership while destroying communal economic systems. Reservations were systematically located on land considered least valuable for agriculture, mining, or settlement. When valuable resources were later discovered on reservation land, the treaties were violated again. The discovery of oil on Osage land in Oklahoma in the early 1900s led to a systematic campaign of murder as white settlers and businessmen killed Osage people to gain control of oil headrights. The FBI investigated at least 60 murders between 1921 and 1926, but historians believe the actual number was closer to hundreds. Osage were poisoned, shot, and blown up with dynamite. White men married Osage women and murdered them and their families to inherit their headrights. Local law enforcement was complicit or participated directly. It took federal intervention to stop the killing spree, and most perpetrators were never prosecuted. The poverty created by land loss, restricted economic opportunities, and systematic underfunding of services has persisted across generations. Today, Native Americans experience poverty rates more than double the national average. Unemployment on some reservations exceeds 80%. Life expectancy is 5 to 7 years shorter than the national average. Suicide rates among Native American youth are 3 times higher than the national average. These are not natural outcomes. They are the direct result of specific policies designed to dispossess, displace, and destroy. One of the most visible contemporary crises affecting indigenous communities is the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. The National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, 5,712 indigenous women and girls were reported missing, but only 116 of those cases were logged in the Department of Justice's Missing Persons database. A 2018 study by the Urban Indian Health Institute identified over 5,000 cases of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, but researchers believe the actual number is significantly higher because many cases are never reported or are misclassified due to racial misidentification. Indigenous women and girls are murdered at rates 10 times higher than the national average. On some reservations, murder is the third leading cause of death for indigenous women. The crisis is rooted in a jurisdictional maze created by federal Indian law that makes it difficult to prosecute crimes on reservations, particularly when the perpetrator is non-native. The Supreme Court ruling in Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe in 1978 stripped tribes of criminal jurisdiction over non-natives who commit crimes on reservation land. This created a legal loophole where non-native perpetrators knew they were unlikely to face prosecution for crimes committed against native women on reservations. The fight for sovereignty and resources continues. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 and 2017 brought international attention to ongoing conflicts over indigenous land and water rights. The pipeline was routed to cross under the Missouri River just upstream of the Standing Rock Reservation, threatening the tribe's water supply. When the pipeline company sought to route it near Bismarck, North Dakota, the route was rejected because of risks to the city's water supply. The decision to reroute it through indigenous land made explicit which population's safety was prioritized. Thousands of people from indigenous nations across North America and non-native allies gathered at Standing Rock to protest the pipeline. The encampments became a site of indigenous cultural revival and political organizing. Private security forces hired by the pipeline company used dogs and pepper spray on protesters. Local law enforcement used water cannons in below-freezing temperatures, deployed rubber bullets and concussion grenades, and arrested hundreds of people. The Obama administration temporarily halted construction in December 2016, but the Trump administration reversed that decision days after taking office, and the pipeline became operational in June 2017. Despite centuries of policies designed to eliminate indigenous people as distinct cultural and political entities, Native American cultures are experiencing a revival. The number of people identifying as Native American in the United States Census has grown from approximately 523,000 in 1960 to 5.9 million in 2020, though some of that growth reflects changes in self-identification rather than population increase. Indigenous languages that were on the verge of extinction are being revitalized through immersion schools and community programs. The Wampanoag language of Massachusetts had no fluent speakers by the early 1900s, but has been reconstructed through analysis of historical documents and is now being taught to a new generation. The Miamia language of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma was extinct by 1960, but is now spoken by several hundred people through a language revitalization program. Legal victories have restored some measure of sovereignty and land rights. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 allowed tribes to take control of federal programs on reservations. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 established the legal framework for tribes to operate casinos, creating a revenue source that has funded education, healthcare, and cultural programs for some nations, though benefits are unevenly distributed. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 requires institutions that receive federal funding to return indigenous human remains and sacred objects to their tribes of origin, forcing museums to confront their role in cultural theft. These gains are real but fragile, dependent on political will that can shift with each election. The fundamental structure of indigenous dispossession remains embedded in American property law, federal Indian policy, and the jurisdictional framework governing reservations. The doctrine of discovery has never been formally renounced by the United States government. It remains the legal foundation for federal authority over indigenous nations. As recently as 2005, the Supreme Court cited the doctrine of discovery in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation, ruling that the Oneida Nation could not reclaim sovereignty over its ancestral lands because too much time had passed since dispossession. The modern United States economy was built on land taken through force and legal fiction. The westward expansion that created the agricultural base of American power was enabled by the removal and extermination of indigenous people. The transcontinental railroads that connected markets and enabled industrial growth were laid across indigenous territory, often in direct violation of treaties. The timber that built American cities was logged from forests that had been indigenous land. The minerals that powered American industry were extracted from mountains that had been sacred sites. The wealth generated by this dispossession compounded across generations through inheritance, creating the racial wealth gap that persists today. The total value of land taken from indigenous nations has never been calculated with precision, but even conservative estimates place it in the trillions of dollars. A 2011 study by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University estimated that the current value of land taken through treaty violations in the western United States alone exceeds $1.5 trillion. That figure does not include the eastern United States, does not include resource extraction, and does not account for lost economic development over multiple generations. The argument that historical injustices are too far in the past to address falls apart when the mechanisms of dispossession remain legally and economically active. Indigenous people still live on reservations established through forced removal. They still face jurisdictional limitations imposed by 19th-century court decisions. They still lack sovereignty over lands guaranteed by treaties the United States government signed and violated. The theft is not historical. It is ongoing. Every acre of the United States was taken from someone. The pastoral image of pioneers settling empty land erases the millions who died to make that land appear empty. The celebration of westward expansion as a story of American courage and ingenuity erases the deliberate policies of removal, cultural destruction, and extermination that made expansion possible. The narrative of manifest destiny transformed genocide into divine will. History is not just about what happened. It is about what we choose to remember, what we choose to teach, and what we choose to redress. For most of American history, the story of indigenous dispossession has been told as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of progress, as tragic but necessary, as regrettable but complete. That narrative is a lie. The dispossession was deliberate, the policies were explicit, and the consequences are not historical. The United States cannot be understood without understanding its original sin. The wealth was built on stolen land. The democracy was built on the exclusion of those who were here first. The expansion was built on elimination. These are not peripheral facts. They are the foundation, and that foundation remains, supporting everything built on top of it, still stained with the blood of 90 million dead. The story of dispossession did not end with the closing of the frontier or the final military defeats of the 19th century. It evolved, became bureaucratic, and embedded itself in systems of administration that continue to extract value from indigenous lands while denying indigenous people control over their own resources and futures. The 20th century brought new forms of exploitation disguised as development and new justifications for maintaining federal control over indigenous sovereignty. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, promoted as a reversal of the destructive allotment policies of the Dawes Act, created a system of tribal governments modeled on American corporate structures. Tribes were encouraged to adopt constitutions approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, elect tribal councils, and incorporate as business entities. The stated goal was self-governance, but the practical effect was to replace traditional forms of indigenous government with bureaucratic structures designed to facilitate resource extraction and federal oversight. Traditional chiefs and clan systems that had governed for centuries were subordinated to elected councils that required Bureau of Indian Affairs approval for major decisions. Not all tribes accepted the Indian Reorganization Act. The Navajo Nation rejected it in a referendum. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy maintained its traditional government structure despite federal pressure. But for many nations, particularly those whose traditional governance had already been disrupted by removal and reservation confinement, the act created governments structured to negotiate resource leases and contracts rather than to exercise genuine sovereignty. The uranium boom of the 1940s and 50s brought a new wave of resource extraction on indigenous lands. The Navajo Nation sits on top of some of the richest uranium deposits in North America. Between 1944 and 1986, nearly 30 million tons of uranium ore were extracted from Navajo land to fuel the American nuclear weapons program and commercial nuclear reactors. The mining companies, operating under federal permits, paid minimal royalties to the tribe while employing Navajo workers in conditions that would have been illegal off the reservation. Navajo uranium miners were not informed that uranium was radioactive or that exposure caused cancer. They were not provided with protective equipment or ventilation systems. They worked in mines where radon gas accumulated to levels hundreds of times higher than safe limits. Many miners used contaminated water from the mines for drinking and brought radioactive dust home on their clothes, exposing their families. The Atomic Energy Commission had studies by the late 1940s showing that uranium mining caused lung cancer, but the information was classified for national security reasons and not shared with the miners. By the 1970s, Navajo uranium miners were dying of lung cancer at rates 5 times higher than the general population. Widows testified to watching their husbands drown in their own lung fluid, coughing up blood and tissue until they suffocated. The mines were abandoned when uranium prices fell in the 1980s, but the companies did not clean up the sites. More than 500 abandoned uranium mines remain on Navajo land, leaching radioactive contamination into groundwater and soil. A 2007 EPA study found that 13% of unregulated water sources on Navajo land exceeded safe drinking water standards for uranium. Children playing near abandoned mines show elevated levels of uranium in their urine. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1990 finally provided limited compensation to uranium miners who could prove they had worked in the mines and had developed specific cancers, but the burden of proof fell on claimants who often lacked employment records from decades earlier. Many miners had died before the act passed. The compensation, capped at $100,000 per claimant, did not cover medical expenses or provide for ongoing monitoring. It was an acknowledgement of harm without adequate redress. While uranium mining poisoned Navajo land, the federal government's nuclear weapons testing program poisoned western Shoshone land in Nevada. Between 1951 and 1992, the United States conducted 928 nuclear tests at the Nevada test site, an area larger than Rhode Island, located on western Shoshone ancestral territory that the tribe never ceded by treaty. The land was declared federal property under the Treaty of Ruby Valley in 1863. But the treaty guaranteed western Shoshone use and occupancy rights. The government simply ignored those rights. The nuclear tests released massive amounts of radioactive fallout that drifted across Shoshone communities downwind from the test site. The Atomic Energy Commission monitored radiation exposure in Shoshone communities, but did not warn residents or evacuate them when fallout levels spiked. Internal documents declassified in the 1990s show that officials considered rural Shoshone populations to be a, quote, 17 whose radiation exposure could provide valuable data on the effects of fallout on humans. The communities became unconsenting subjects in a radiation experiment. Cancer rates in Shoshone communities downwind from the test site are significantly elevated compared to national averages. Studies have documented increased rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-related diseases. A 2002 study by the National Cancer Institute estimated that fallout from the Nevada tests caused between 11,000 and 212,000 excess thyroid cancers in the United States, with the highest concentrations in communities closest to the test site, many of them Shoshone. The federal government's relationship with Indigenous water rights in the 20th century followed a consistent pattern of acknowledging rights in theory while denying them in practice. The Winters Doctrine, established by the Supreme Court in 1908, recognized that when the federal government created reservations, it implicitly reserved sufficient water rights to fulfill the purpose of the reservation. In theory, this gave tribes senior water rights predating most non-native claims in the arid West. In practice, the Bureau of Reclamation built massive dam and irrigation projects throughout the 20th century that diverted water from rivers flowing through reservations, without compensating tribes or delivering the water guaranteed by treaty. The construction of the Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River in the 1950s flooded sacred sites of the Navajo Nation and disrupted traditional agricultural practices along the river. The Navajo were not consulted in the planning process, received no compensation for the loss, and gained no guaranteed water allocation from the reservoir created by the dam. Meanwhile, cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas grew into sprawling metropolitan areas on water that should have been reserved for indigenous communities with senior rights. The Pick-Sloan Plan, authorized by the Flood Control Act of 1944, constructed 5 major dams on the Missouri River that flooded over 220,000 acres of reservation land belonging to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the Standing Rock Sioux, the Cheyenne River Sioux, the Crow Creek Sioux, the Lower Brule Sioux, and the Yankton Sioux. The dams destroyed the most fertile agricultural land on the reservations, flooded traditional villages and burial grounds, and severed communities by placing them on opposite sides of massive reservoirs. The Army Corps of Engineers assured the tribes that they would receive electricity from the dams and priority access to water for irrigation. Neither promise was kept. The electricity generated by the dams was sold to off-reservation customers. Irrigation systems promised to the tribes were never built. The compensation paid for the land was calculated at 1949 prices and did not account for the loss of traditional livelihoods, sacred sites, or community cohesion. Families that had farmed river bottom land for generations were relocated to arid uplands unsuitable for agriculture. The psychological and cultural impact of the dam projects was immediate and devastating. Tribal members described the flooding of ancestral lands as a second trail of tears. Elderly people who had lived their entire lives in river-bottom communities refused to leave their homes and had to be forcibly relocated as the reservoirs filled. Suicide rates on the affected reservations increased sharply in the years following the dam construction. The social fabric of communities that had been stable for generations unraveled. While the federal government was flooding indigenous land for hydroelectric projects, it was simultaneously promoting the termination of federal recognition for tribes deemed ready for assimilation into mainstream American society. House Concurrent Resolution 108, passed in 1953, declared it federal policy to end the trust relationship between the United States government and indigenous nations as rapidly as possible. The resolution led to the termination of federal recognition for over 100 tribes between 1953 and 1964. Termination meant that tribes lost their reservation land, which was either sold to non-natives or distributed to individual tribal members who often sold it to pay taxes they could not afford. Terminated tribes lost access to federal services, including health care and education. They lost their sovereign status and became subject to state jurisdiction. The Klamath tribes of Oregon, one of the wealthiest tribes in the country due to timber resources, were terminated in 1954. Tribal members received cash payments for their share of communal assets, but within a generation, most of the money was gone, the land was sold, and former tribal members were living in poverty. The Klamath regained federal recognition in 1986, but the land was never returned. The Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin was terminated in 1961. The tribe owned a 234,000-acre forest and operated a successful lumber mill that provided employment and revenue for the community. Termination transformed the reservation into a county and the tribe into a corporation. The forest was sold off. The hospital closed. The mill became unprofitable and shut down. Unemployment on the former reservation reached 90% within a decade. The Menominee fought for restoration of federal recognition for 13 years, finally succeeding in 1973, but the economic damage was permanent. Concurrent with the termination policy, the Bureau of Indian Affairs operated the Indian Relocation Program, also known as the Urban Relocation Program, from 1952 to 1972. The program encouraged Indigenous people to leave reservations and move to cities with the promise of job training, employment assistance, and housing. Participants were given one-way bus tickets to cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco, a small relocation allowance, and the address of a relocation office. The reality rarely matched the promise. Job training was minimal or non-existent. The jobs that were available were low-wage and often temporary. The housing assistance typically consisted of a list of addresses in low-income neighborhoods, many of which were hostile to Indigenous newcomers. Relocated individuals and families found themselves isolated in unfamiliar cities, without community support, unable to afford to return to their reservations, and unprepared for urban poverty that was different from, but no less severe than, reservation poverty. The program was successful in its unstated goal of reducing reservation populations and weakening tribal communities. Over 100,000 Indigenous people relocated to cities under the program. Many never returned to their reservations. The program created the urban Indigenous population that now comprises over 70% of Native Americans in the United States, but it also severed many individuals from their cultural communities and created generations of people disconnected from both reservation and urban life. The Indigenous activism that emerged in the 1960s and 70s was a direct response to termination, relocation, and continued federal paternalism. The occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969 by Indigenous activists, claiming the abandoned federal prison under treaty rights that allowed Indigenous people to claim unused federal land, brought national attention to treaty violations and the failure of federal Indian policy. The occupation lasted 19 months and inspired a wave of Indigenous activism across the country. The American Indian Movement, founded in 1968, organized protests, occupied Bureau of Indian Affairs offices, and demanded tribal sovereignty and treaty enforcement. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, where activists held the site of the 1890 massacre for 71 days while surrounded by federal agents and military forces, was an explicit confrontation with the legacy of Indigenous genocide. 2 activists were killed during the siege. The trials of participants dragged on for years, but the occupation succeeded in forcing national media coverage of reservation conditions and tribal demands. The activism achieved significant legal victories. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 reversed termination policy and allowed tribes to administer federal programs on reservations. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 acknowledged the constitutional right of Indigenous people to practice traditional religions, reversing nearly a century of legal prohibition. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 addressed the crisis of Indigenous children being removed from their families by state child welfare agencies at rates far exceeding other populations, and placed in non-native foster or adoptive homes, a practice that had become a de facto continuation of the boarding school system's policy of cultural assimilation through child removal. Before the Indian Child Welfare Act, studies showed that 25 to 35% of Indigenous children were being removed from their families by state agencies, compared to less than 5% of non-native children. In states like Minnesota, 1 in 8 Indigenous children was in foster care. Many were placed in non-native homes where they were forbidden from practicing their culture or maintaining contact with their tribes. The act established minimum federal standards for child welfare cases involving Indigenous children, gave tribes jurisdiction over those cases, and required agencies to make active efforts to keep Indigenous families together. The implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act has been inconsistent, and state agencies have resisted tribal jurisdiction, but the act has reduced the rate of Indigenous child removal and preserved thousands of families. Challenges to the act's constitutionality continue in federal courts, with opponents arguing that preferences for placing Indigenous children with Indigenous families constitute racial discrimination. A case currently before the Supreme Court could overturn the act entirely, which would remove one of the few legal protections Indigenous families have against the state child welfare system.
The discovery of oil and natural gas on reservation lands in the late 20th century created new opportunities for tribal revenue, but also exposed tribes to exploitation by energy companies and federal mismanagement of trust assets. The federal government holds reservation lands in trust, meaning the government manages leases and resource extraction on behalf of tribes and is legally required to act in the tribe's best interest. In practice, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of the Interior systematically mismanaged Indigenous trust accounts for over a century. In 1996, Eloise Coble, a member of the Blackfeet Nation and a banker, filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government for the mismanagement of individual Indian money accounts, trust accounts where the government was supposed to deposit royalties from resource extraction on allotted lands. The lawsuit revealed that the Department of the Interior could not account for billions of dollars in trust funds, had lost records of land ownership and lease agreements, and in some cases had failed to collect royalties from energy companies at all. The Coble case went through 15 years of litigation, 5 trials, and 10 appeals. The judge found that the Department of the Interior had committed, quote, 19, quote. The government admitted it could not provide an accurate accounting of the trust accounts because the records had been destroyed, lost, or never properly maintained in the first place. In 2009, the government agreed to a settlement of $3.4 billion to be distributed among approximately 300,000 individual account holders. The average payment was less than $2,000 per person, a fraction of what was actually owed, but it was the largest settlement against the United States government in history. The settlement did not address ongoing mismanagement of tribal trust accounts, where billions of dollars in royalties from oil, gas, timber, and mineral extraction continue to flow through federal agencies before reaching tribes. Audits consistently show that tribes receive less than they are owed, that lease terms favor extraction companies over tribes, and that the Bureau of Indian Affairs approves resource development projects without adequate environmental review or tribal consent. The environmental consequences of resource extraction on indigenous lands have been catastrophic in many cases. The Navajo Nation deals not only with abandoned uranium mines, but also with coal ash contamination from power plants, groundwater depletion from coal mining, and air pollution from coal-fired generating stations built on or near the reservation to provide electricity to cities in Arizona, Nevada, and California. The tribe receives minimal revenue from the plants while bearing the health and environmental costs. The Gold King mine spill in 2015 released 3 million gallons of toxic wastewater containing heavy metals into the Animas River, a primary water source for the Navajo Nation. The spill was caused by an Environmental Protection Agency cleanup crew accidentally breaching a containment wall at an abandoned gold mine in Colorado. The toxic plume turned the river orange and contaminated water used for drinking, irrigation, and livestock. The EPA initially downplayed the severity of the contamination, and cleanup efforts focused on areas downstream from Navajo land. Tests of soil and water on Navajo land years after the spill continue to show elevated levels of arsenic and lead. The fight over the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access pipeline in the 2010s revealed that the pattern of prioritizing development over indigenous rights has not changed. Both pipelines were routed through indigenous territory with minimal consultation, environmental review processes that tribes argued were inadequate, and federal approval processes that tribes argued violated treaty obligations. The resistance at Standing Rock in particular demonstrated that when indigenous people assert their rights, they are still met with state violence. The militarized police response to the Standing Rock protests included the deployment of armored vehicles, LRADS, sound cannons, tear gas, rubber bullets, and mass arrests. Private security contractors working for the pipeline company conducted aerial surveillance of the camps and kept lists of activists. Local law enforcement coordinated with the pipeline company and shared information about protest plans. The treatment of water protectors at Standing Rock mirrored the historical treatment of indigenous resistance.
assert rights, face violence, watch the government side with corporate interests. Climate change is now creating a new crisis for indigenous communities, particularly those in Alaska, where coastal villages are being destroyed by erosion and melting permafrost. The village of Kivalina, home to approximately 400 Inupiat people, is literally falling into the ocean as the barrier island it sits on erodes without the protection of sea ice that used to form along the coast. The Army Corps of Engineers estimates the village will be uninhabitable by 2025. Relocation would cost up to $400 million. The federal government has provided minimal assistance, forcing the village to file lawsuits against oil companies for their role in creating the climate change that is destroying the community. At least 30 Alaska Native villages are facing similar threats from erosion and flooding. The residents are climate refugees in their own country, forced to abandon ancestral lands, not by military force, but by rising seas and collapsing permafrost. The federal government has no coherent policy for climate-driven relocation of indigenous communities, and no designated funding source for the billions of dollars it would cost to move villages to safe ground. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the continuing health disparities in indigenous communities and the consequences of chronic underfunding of the Indian Health Service. Native Americans were infected with and died from COVID-19 at rates far higher than other populations. The Navajo Nation at one point had the highest per capita infection rate in the United States. Contributing factors included overcrowded multi-generational housing due to a shortage of housing on reservations, limited access to running water, and underlying health conditions like diabetes and heart disease that are prevalent in indigenous communities. The Indian Health Service, the federal agency responsible for providing health care to indigenous people, is chronically underfunded. Per capita spending on indigenous healthcare is approximately half the per capita spending in the general United States healthcare system. Facilities are outdated, understaffed, and lack basic equipment. Wait times for appointments can be months long. Specialists are often unavailable, requiring patients to travel hundreds of miles for care that would be routine in urban areas. The underfunding is not an accident. It is a continuation of the policy of neglect that has characterized federal treatment of indigenous people since the reservation system was established. The compounding crises facing indigenous communities, poverty, health disparities, missing and murdered indigenous women, environmental destruction, climate displacement are not separate issues. They are the ongoing consequences of the foundational dispossession that created the United States. Every crisis can be traced directly to federal policies that took indigenous land, destroyed indigenous economies, and created systems of dependency and control that persist today. The total land area of current reservations is approximately 56 million acres, less than 3% of the original indigenous land base within the current United States borders. That land is disproportionately arid, remote, and resource poor, the leftovers after everything valuable was taken. The wealth generated from the land that was taken, converted into agricultural production, industrial development, resource extraction, and urban real estate, has compounded for generations. The descendants of settlers who received free land through the Homestead Act have accumulated wealth through property ownership that they can pass to their children. The descendants of indigenous people whose land was stolen have inherited poverty, trauma, and systematic exclusion from the mechanisms of wealth accumulation. The United States has never conducted a full accounting of the value of indigenous land taken through treaty violations, forced removal, allotment, and termination. It has never calculated the value of resources extracted from that land. It has never compensated tribes for the destruction of cultural sites, the loss of traditional livelihoods, or the health consequences of environmental contamination. The few settlements that have been reached, the Black Hills Claim, the Cobell Settlement, are fractions of what is actually owed and come with no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of the theft. The absence of acknowledgement is deliberate. To fully account for the scope of indigenous dispossession would require confronting the fact that the entire structure of American property ownership, resource extraction, and economic development rests on a foundation of theft and genocide. It would require recognizing that the poverty of indigenous communities and the wealth of American society are causally connected. It would demand redress on a scale that would fundamentally reshape American society. The narrative of American history taught in most schools still frames westward expansion as heroic, indigenous resistance as tragic but futile,
and the current status of reservations as a regrettable but closed chapter. Textbooks describe treaties as misunderstandings, not deliberate frauds. They present the boarding schools as misguided attempts to help indigenous people assimilate, not as instruments of cultural genocide. They treat the reservation system as a humanitarian effort to preserve indigenous populations, not as a system of internal colonization designed to contain and control. This sanitized history serves a purpose. It allows Americans to benefit from dispossession without confronting the violence that enabled it. It transforms genocide into manifest destiny, theft into settlement, and resistance into savagery. It makes the current distribution of land and wealth seem natural, even inevitable, rather than the product of specific policies carried out by identifiable people with documented intent. The primary sources, the treaties, the congressional records, the military orders, the boarding school regulations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs memos, are available in archives. The intent is explicit in the language. The doctrine of discovery is written into Supreme Court decisions. The phrase __quote_20___ was not a rogue statement by one school administrator. It was federal policy. The deliberate destruction of the bison herds was documented by the military officers who carried it out. The use of smallpox as a biological weapon was discussed in letters between British commanders. The forced removals, the broken treaties, the massacres, the land theft, all of it is documented. The question is not whether these things happened. The question is what contemporary American society chooses to do with that knowledge. Indigenous nations still exist. They are still fighting for sovereignty, for treaty rights, for the return of sacred sites, for clean water, for justice for missing and murdered women, for the survival of their languages and cultures. The theft is not complete. The resistance continues. And the choice of whether to honor treaties, return land, provide adequate resources, and acknowledge the truth belongs to the American public and government right now. The United States is a nation built on land taken from people who never relinquished their claim to it, enriched by resources extracted from that land, and sustained by legal and economic systems that continued to exclude the original inhabitants from the wealth their land generated. That is not a metaphor. That is the material reality measured in acres, in dollars, in bodies, in languages lost, in rivers poisoned, in children who never came home from boarding schools and are buried in unmarked graves. The argument that these injustices are too far in the past to matter collapses under the weight of present evidence. A Navajo child drinking water contaminated with uranium from mines that operated until 1986 is not living in the distant past. A family in Kivalina watching their village sink into the ocean is not experiencing historical trauma. A mother searching for her missing daughter, who will likely never be found because jurisdictional chaos prevents proper investigation, is not mourning ancient history. The mechanisms of dispossession are active, the consequences are current, the beneficiaries are living. The land acknowledgments that have become common at academic conferences and cultural events, statements recognizing that an institution sits on the traditional territory of a specific indigenous nation, are often dismissed as empty gestures. The criticism has merit when acknowledgment is not followed by action, but the fact that institutions feel compelled to acknowledge indigenous land rights at all represents a shift in consciousness. It creates an opening to ask the next question. If this is indigenous land, why does the institution own it?
And what does the institution owe to the people from whom it was taken? Some institutions are beginning to answer that question with more than words. In 2019, the Episcopal Church announced it would allocate resources to research its complicity in Indigenous dispossession and genocide, including the Church's operation of boarding schools where Indigenous children died. In 2021, the Department of the Interior launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to investigate the system, identify burial sites, and create a public record of what happened. The Canadian government conducted a similar investigation beginning in 2008 and identified the remains of thousands of children in unmarked graves at former residential schools.
The United States investigation is ongoing, but preliminary reports have already identified over 400 schools and at least 500 documented deaths, numbers that researchers believe represent a fraction of the actual toll. The return of land is happening in isolated cases. In 2020, the Esselen tribe of California received 1,200 acres of ancestral land in Big Sur through a conservation purchase. In 2021, the city of Eureka, California, returned 202 acres to the Wiyot tribe, land that includes the site of the 1860 Wiyot massacre, where white settlers killed between 60 and 200 Wiyot people. In 2022, the Sioux tribes of South Dakota began purchasing land in the Black Hills from private owners willing to sell, slowly reassembling fragments of the territory stolen in the 1870s. These are symbolic victories, important for the communities involved, but they do not approach the scale of return that treaty obligations would require. The more common approach has been financial settlements that compensate for specific harms without addressing the underlying structure of dispossession. The settlements are structured to close cases, not to restore what was taken. They allow the United States government to acknowledge wrongdoing in isolated instances while maintaining that the overall framework of property ownership and sovereignty is legitimate and settled. The Sioux rejection of over $1 billion in compensation for the Black Hills stands as a rejection of that framework. The land was never for sale. Money cannot replace what was stolen, because what was stolen was not a commodity. It was home. The scope of what full redress would require is staggering. Honoring every treaty would return millions of acres currently held by federal, state, and private interests. Providing reparations for resources extracted from Indigenous land would cost trillions of dollars. Granting full sovereignty to Indigenous nations would create hundreds of independent governments within the current borders of the United States, with authority over their citizens and territory. The political will for changes of that magnitude does not currently exist in American society, but the absence of political will does not erase the debt. The debate over reparations for slavery has gained significant traction in recent years, with serious legislative proposals, academic research on implementation, and public polling showing increased support, particularly among younger Americans. The conversation about reparations for Indigenous dispossession has been quieter, perhaps because acknowledging the full scope of what is owed would require not just financial transfers, but territorial concessions. It is one thing to calculate the value of stolen labor and unpaid wages. It is another to calculate the value of an entire continent and acknowledge that current property ownership rests on fraudulent foundations. Yet the moral claim remains regardless of practical obstacles. The United States signed treaties as agreements between sovereign nations. Under international law and under the United States Constitution, treaties are binding legal obligations. The systematic violation of those treaties represents not just historical wrongdoing, but ongoing breach of contract. The indigenous nations that signed those treaties still exist. They still have legal standing. They still have the right to demand that the agreements be honored.
The survival of indigenous nations, despite 5 centuries of policies designed to eliminate them, is itself an act of resistance. The revitalization of languages declared dead, the continuation of ceremonies banned by law, the assertion of treaty rights in federal courts, the protection of sacred sites, the recovery of remains and sacred objects from museums, the fight for clean water and environmental protection, all of it represents the refusal to accept that dispossession is final or that history is closed. The young people at Standing Rock who faced police violence to protect water, the language teachers working to ensure their grandchildren can speak the words their great-grandparents were beaten for speaking, the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women demanding that law enforcement treat Indigenous lives as worthy of investigation, the tribal governments fighting to maintain sovereignty against state encroachment. They are not fighting for symbolic victories or historical acknowledgement. They are fighting for survival, for land, for resources, for the future of their nations. American society has a choice about how to respond to that fight.
It can continue to treat Indigenous claims as historical grievances that have been adequately addressed through past settlements and current programs. It can continue to frame poverty and health crises in Indigenous communities as failures of those communities rather than as direct consequences of dispossession. It can continue to celebrate westward expansion and American exceptionalism without confronting the genocide that made both possible. Or it can acknowledge that the United States was built on stolen land, that the theft continues, and that the people from whom the land was stolen are still here, still demanding justice, and still owed a debt that has never been paid. The archaeological sites of vanished civilizations are treated as treasures, objects of fascination and study. Tourists visit Machu Picchu and marvel at Incan engineering. They tour the pyramids and wonder at the knowledge required to build them. But the indigenous civilizations of the Americas were not destroyed by time or natural disaster. They were destroyed by deliberate policy implemented by people with names and titles who left records of their intentions. The emptiness that visitors encounter when they tour ancient sites in the Americas is not the mystery of lost peoples. It is the consequence of documented genocide. The forests are full of ghosts. The rivers carry the names of peoples who were killed for living beside them. The mountains are sacred to nations confined to reservations hundreds of miles away. The land remembers even when the society built on top of it tries to forget. And beneath the cities, the highways, the farms, the national parks, the subdivisions, the shopping centers, beneath all of it, the original claim persists. Every acre was taken from someone. Every treaty was broken. Every promise was a lie. And the children of the dispossessed are still alive, still fighting, still refusing to disappear as the architects of manifest destiny intended. The story is not over. The debt is not paid. The land is not settled. The museums of the United States hold the remains of tens of thousands of indigenous ancestors, removed from burial sites by archaeologists, grave robbers, and military officers who treated indigenous bodies as curiosities and scientific specimens rather than as human beings entitled to rest. The Smithsonian Institution alone held the remains of over 18,000 indigenous people before the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Many were cataloged by measurements of skull size and bone structure, used to construct racist, pseudoscientific theories of indigenous inferiority. The remains sat in storage drawers and display cases for decades, while descendants fought for their return. The repatriation process established by the 1990 Act requires institutions to inventory their collections, consult with tribes, and return remains and sacred objects to their communities of origin. The process has been slow. Institutions often claim they cannot determine which tribe has the right to claim specific remains. They argue that sacred objects have historical and scientific value that justifies continued retention. They require extensive documentation from tribes proving cultural affiliation, placing the burden of proof on communities whose records were often destroyed by the same institutions now demanding evidence. Thousands of ancestors remain unreturned in museum collections more than 3 decades after the law passed.
The continued retention of indigenous remains and sacred objects is not a neutral act of preservation. It is an assertion of ownership over indigenous bodies and culture, a refusal to recognize that indigenous nations have the right to control their own dead and their own spiritual practices. When museums display sacred objects torn from their ceremonial context, labeled and interpreted by non-indigenous curators, they participate in the same logic of domination that justified the original theft. The objects are not art, they are not artifacts. They are living pieces of spiritual practice that were stolen and are being held hostage. The erasure of indigenous people from American consciousness extends beyond physical displacement to symbolic erasure through mascots, place names, and cultural appropriation. Professional sports teams used indigenous imagery and names for decades, reducing complex nations to cartoon figures and war chants performed by fans who knew nothing of the cultures they were mimicking. The Washington football team finally retired its slur-based name in 2020 after years of protests by indigenous activists. The Cleveland baseball team followed in 2021.
The Kansas City Chiefs, the Atlanta Braves, and numerous college teams continue to use indigenous imagery despite objections from indigenous communities. The argument that such imagery honors indigenous people collapses when indigenous people themselves say it does not. The National Congress of American Indians, the largest indigenous advocacy organization in the United States, has called for the elimination of indigenous mascots since 1968. Studies have shown that exposure to indigenous mascots increases stereotyping and decreases self-esteem among indigenous youth. The harm is documented. The benefits accrue to franchises that profit from merchandise and brand recognition. The teams claim tradition. Indigenous activists point out that tradition rooted in disrespect is not worth preserving. The appropriation of indigenous culture extends into fashion, music festivals, wellness industries, and spiritual tourism. Non-indigenous people wear headdresses as costumes, participate in sweat lodge ceremonies led by self-proclaimed shamans with no connection to indigenous communities, and purchase dream catchers mass-produced in factories overseas. The appropriation is defended as appreciation, but appreciation requires understanding context, respecting boundaries, and centering the voices of the people whose culture is being borrowed. What is practiced instead is extraction, taking elements of indigenous culture deemed beautiful or exotic while ignoring the contemporary struggles of indigenous communities and the history of violence that nearly destroyed those cultures. The fight over sacred sites continues in courts and on the ground. Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, established in 2016 to protect indigenous sacred sites and archaeological resources, was reduced by 85% in 2017, opening previously protected land to mining and drilling. The monument was restored to its original boundaries in 2021, but the episode demonstrated the precariousness of protections that depend on executive action rather than indigenous sovereignty. The San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, sacred to over a dozen indigenous nations, were developed for skiing despite protests and lawsuits. The resort uses treated sewage water to make artificial snow on a mountain where indigenous people gather sacred plants and conduct ceremonies. The courts ruled that the religious rights of indigenous people did not outweigh the economic interests of the ski resort and the recreational preferences of tourists. Oak Flat in Arizona, a site sacred to the Apache and used for coming-of-age ceremonies for generations, is slated to be destroyed by a copper mine. The land was transferred to a mining company through a rider attached to a defense spending bill in 2014, a tactic that bypassed normal environmental review and consultation processes. The mine will create a crater over 1,000 feet deep and 2 miles wide, completely destroying the surface. Apache activists have occupied the site, filed lawsuits, and appealed to international human rights bodies. As of now, the mine is moving forward. The destruction of a sacred site for copper to be sold on international markets is considered acceptable under American law. The legal framework that allows such destruction is rooted in the same principle that has governed federal Indian policy since the beginning:
Indigenous people have religious beliefs, but those beliefs do not carry the same legal weight as property rights or economic development. Indigenous people can practice their religion, but only if it does not interfere with the exploitation of land and resources. The First Amendment protects religious freedom, but courts have consistently ruled that protecting indigenous sacred sites would constitute an unconstitutional establishment of religion. The logic is circular and designed to ensure that indigenous spiritual claims never outweigh non-indigenous economic interests. The intellectual property theft of indigenous knowledge represents another dimension of ongoing extraction. Pharmaceutical companies have developed drugs based on indigenous medicinal knowledge without compensation or credit.
The rosy periwinkle, used by traditional healers in Madagascar, became the source of drugs to treat leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma, generating billions in revenue for pharmaceutical companies. The healers received nothing. The neem tree, used in traditional medicine across South Asia, has been the subject of over 70 patents by Western companies, despite protests that the knowledge is traditional and communal. Indigenous agricultural knowledge, developed over millennia of careful cultivation and selection, has been appropriated through patents on crop varieties that indigenous farmers developed but never owned in the Western legal sense. The current international framework for protecting traditional knowledge is inadequate. The Convention on Biological Diversity recognizes the rights of indigenous people to benefit from the use of their traditional knowledge, but the United States has not ratified the treaty. Domestic patent law does not recognize communal or traditional knowledge as prior art that would prevent patents on indigenous innovations. The result is a system where indigenous knowledge can be legally stolen, repackaged as Western innovation, and sold back to the communities that developed it. Climate change is accelerating the destruction of indigenous lands and threatening the survival of indigenous communities in ways that compound historical dispossession. Rising temperatures are making traditional hunting and fishing grounds unusable. Changing precipitation patterns are destroying agricultural systems adapted to specific rainfall cycles. Melting permafrost in the Arctic is releasing mercury and other contaminants that accumulate in fish and game that indigenous communities depend on for food. Ocean acidification is destroying shellfish populations that have been harvested sustainably for thousands of years. Indigenous communities contributed least to the emissions driving climate change, but are experiencing some of its most severe impacts. The indigenous communities facing climate displacement have legal rights under treaties and under international human rights law, but those rights provide no clear mechanism for demanding relocation assistance or compensation for destroyed homelands. When the Army Corps of Engineers estimated it would cost $400 million to relocate Kivalina, there was no federal budget line for climate-driven relocation of indigenous villages. The community was advised to apply for disaster relief funds, but climate change is not recognized as a discrete disaster event that triggers emergency funding. The residents are left in legal and bureaucratic limbo, watching their village erode while arguing with federal agencies over who is responsible for moving them to safety. The same federal government that forced indigenous people onto reservations at gunpoint now claims it lacks authority or funding to help them move when those reservations become uninhabitable due to climate change the government's own policies accelerated. The irony is lost on no one in the affected communities. They were forced onto marginal land. The land is becoming unlivable, and they are told that helping them is beyond the government's capacity or responsibility. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed in stark terms the consequences of chronic underfunding and neglect. The Indian Health Service entered the pandemic with an estimated 32% shortfall in funding needed to provide adequate health care. Facilities lacked basic supplies, testing capacity was limited, contact tracing was nearly impossible in remote communities with limited internet and phone service. The Navajo Nation imposed some of the strictest lockdown measures in the country, including weekend curfews and road closures,
because tribal leadership knew the healthcare system could not handle a surge in cases. The measures worked, but they required sacrifices, economic hardship, and isolation that should not have been necessary if the federal government had fulfilled its trust responsibility to provide adequate health care. The trust responsibility, the principle that the federal government has a legal and moral obligation to protect indigenous interests in exchange for the land and sovereignty that tribes ceded through treaties, has been invoked repeatedly by the government to justify its control over indigenous affairs, while simultaneously being ignored when it would require actual resources or action. The government claims trust authority to approve or deny tribal decisions about resource development, education, and governance. The government disclaims trust responsibility when tribes demand adequate funding for health care, infrastructure, and education. The trust relationship is enforced when it serves federal interests and ignored when it would cost federal money. The future of indigenous nations in North America depends on factors largely beyond their control: political wins in Washington and Ottawa, judicial appointments to federal courts, global commodity prices that determine whether resource extraction on indigenous land is profitable, climate change driven by emissions from industrialized nations. Indigenous communities have agency and are fighting for their survival and sovereignty, but the structural constraints imposed by federal Indian law, property regimes, and economic systems limit the range of possible outcomes. The question facing American society is whether it will continue to treat indigenous people as obstacles to be managed, wards to be supervised, or historical artifacts to be commemorated, or whether it will recognize indigenous nations as sovereign governments with rights that predate the United States and obligations that the United States assumed through treaties and has never fulfilled. The choice will determine whether the future holds genuine partnership and restitution or continued marginalization and extraction. The architects of Manifest Destiny believed that indigenous people would vanish, that they would be absorbed into the American population or die out completely, leaving behind only place names and museum exhibits. They were wrong. Indigenous people did not vanish. They survived genocide, disease, forced removal, cultural destruction, boarding schools, termination, relocation, environmental contamination, and systematic neglect. They survived, and their nations persist. The demographic recovery of indigenous populations, the revitalization of languages, the reassertion of treaty rights, the growing political organization and legal sophistication of tribal governments all represent the failure of elimination. The United States tried for over 2 centuries to solve what it called the Indian problem through violence, assimilation, and neglect. The problem was never solved because indigenous people refused to become a problem that could be solved. They remained peoples, nations, with rights and claims that could not be extinguished by law or force. The history of indigenous dispossession is not a closed chapter. It is the foundation on which the present is built, and that foundation is cracked. Every unresolved treaty claim, every contaminated water source, every missing woman, every language speaker teaching children words their ancestors were beaten for speaking, every occupation of sacred land threatened by development represents a crack in the narrative of settled history and legitimate ownership. The cracks are widening. The United States can continue to paper over those cracks with symbolic gestures and inadequate settlements, or it can confront the fact that the entire structure of American prosperity is built on land that was never legally or morally ceded, that treaties are binding obligations, not historical curiosities, and that the debt owed to indigenous nations is not measured in billions, but in the return of sovereignty, land, and the right to determine their own futures without federal interference. The choice belongs to the American public and to the elected officials who claim to represent them. Indigenous nations have already made their choice. They will continue to fight for what was taken, for what was promised, and for what they never surrendered. The resistance has lasted 500 years. It will continue until the debt is acknowledged and the land is returned, or until there is no one left to remember what was stolen. And the evidence suggests that indigenous peoples have no intention of forgetting. Every Thanksgiving, Americans celebrate a myth of peaceful cooperation between Pilgrims and Wampanoag, a story designed to obscure the violence that followed. Every 4th of July, Americans celebrate independence and freedom on land taken from people who were never granted either. Every Columbus Day, renamed Indigenous Peoples Day in some jurisdictions but still a federal holiday, commemorates the beginning of the largest genocide in human history. The national mythology is built on erasure, on the lie that the land was empty, that the treaties were honored, that the violence was regrettable but necessary, that history is settled. The land was never empty, the treaties were never honored, the violence was never necessary, and history is not settled. The indigenous nations of North America are still here, still sovereign, still owed a debt that compounds with every generation. The forests remember, the rivers remember, the mountains remember, and the people remember. The bill has not been paid.